All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're back. I'm Michael Casey. I'm the Chief Content Officer at Coindesk, and I'm thrilled to be part of this OECD panel. We're going to be drilling down into a complicated but very, very important question, issues around the governance of decentralized systems and the compatibility, really, of blockchains with existing government, corporate, and other centralized systems. We've got a fantastic panel from representatives from both government and industry, from spread all over the world. This is one of those classic gatherings that is truly international, and I'm really looking forward to introducing them. But before I do, some quick housekeeping notes. There is the opportunity for the audience to ask questions, so just feel free to type into the Q&A module that you have on your site any questions you have, and we'll have a chance to look at those, and if luckily enough we'll get some time to run with them, so we'll get some questions to the panelists, and so just feel free to use that. There's also going to be a poll at some point. I'll be letting you know when that runs, and we'd love to get your feedback and answers to the question that's asked there. That will be available in the top right hand corner of your poll. I'll give you more detail when of your panel. When that comes up, I'll let you know. So let me first introduce the panel. We've got some absolutely sort of top-notch people here. First of all, there's Cara LaPointe, who is co-director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy. Hello, Cara. We also have Samson Mow, the Chief Strategy Officer for Blockstream, and Yuta Takanashi, who is the Director for International Digital Strategy and Policy at the Japanese Financial Services Authority. So it really is, as you can tell, quite a diverse group from academia, from government, and from straight out of the Bitcoin crypto world. And to me, that's the right place to go. Unfortunately, York Rhodes, who was originally on the program from Microsoft, could not make it on this particular day. So I just want to frame things a little bit to start with. The question here is really somewhat technical, but fundamental to, I think, some core questions that society itself is asking. I think we're at a moment in history where we are starting to ask real questions about governance generally. The COVID crisis, perhaps, as much as anything, has exposed this. We've seen the inability, for example, of supply chains that are structured around a centrally controlled system to be able to deliver on time from anywhere in the world the medical equipment and needs that we have. And we've just sort of seen something of a breakdown in the capacity as a society generally to manage something that is in itself decentralized. A pandemic really doesn't pay attention to borders or corporate structures. It chooses where it wants to go. And as a result, we collectively have to manage that. And we've been faced with problems such as how do we use public information that is necessary for the management of that crisis, at the same time that we need to protect the individual rights of individuals in terms of the information they provide. So this is a hot button topic when it comes to public health, obviously. But we've also seen clearly some stress in the global economy and some big questions around the future of finance as central banks are pouring money into the system, particularly the Federal Reserve, to try to contain the fallout from the lockdowns and all the other activities, raising questions about the capacity of the existing financial system to deal with that and the independence of central banks. So then we've got this moment coinciding with the emergence of these new technologies. So a real sort of perfect storm. We're seeing, central banks such as China and very recently a much smaller country, the Bahamas, coming out with their digital currencies, which in itself raise really interesting questions about decentralized management of money versus a centralized government entity. And then the rise of interest again in cryptocurrencies and permissionless blockchains with big news around DeFi, the decentralized financial systems that are being built on Ethereum, and then Bitcoin in recent days getting to all-time highs, at least in terms of its market capitalization, reflecting, I think, a real interest in this alternative, a digital gold alternative to the existing system. So lots of big questions around how the world is being governed and the rise of these technologies, the big question we're going to talk about today is how do we actually govern these systems themselves? How do we bring into play a mechanism by which these models, without this centralized control, can be serving the interests of society at large in a way that is constructive. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is throw to Cara. And Cara, I think maybe, you perhaps just give us some stage setting remarks here about, some of the core, almost ethical questions that come up as we think about how we work with these decentralized systems in society as it is. I'll leave it to you to take over from here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And kind of building on the comments of what you just said is that we're living in this time of a perfect storm, right? Where we're seeing in the financial system, but not just the financial system, in all sorts of traditional institutions, a disruption, major disruptions over the last several decades in terms of an erosion of trust and disruptions in kind of the stability of institutions, whether it's financial or medical systems or commerce systems, government, education, and blockchain was really born in these truly decentralized systems out of this idea that can you start to replace some of the trust that's eroded in institutions and eroded in interhuman interactions with this technology, right? This technology of trust we often call blockchain. And so it builds up this system where you can have these interactions, you can have these kind of peer-to-peer actions over decentralized networks with this trust from the system. But that's where the reality of technology crashes into humanity, right? Because technology is a tool of humanity. And ultimately, we need to understand what we want out of this tool, right? What do we want the effects of this tool to be? Because decentralized systems are a very powerful tool when you start to think about what it means in terms of giving ownership over different assets, right? In terms of identity, in terms of privacy, right? I think, as you mentioned before, in terms of kind of there's this right to be forgotten in some places, but how do you align that with a blockchain? So there's some fundamental issues around access to information, who gets to own information, who gets to put information that's on a blockchain that then becomes part of this decentralized immutable system, right? And so governance is really at the heart of that, because governance is where the humanity comes crashing into the technology, and you figure out, what do we want as a society out of this tool? How do we want to design the rules of a given decentralized system, right? So that then everything that happens on that system is validated to those rules. So who gets to be part of that discussion of setting up this governance, right? What does the governance mean in terms of all of those potential ethical and societal implications of the technology? I think that's why the technology piece the governance piece of blockchain is so important, because it's our opportunity from the very beginning as we set up a given decentralized system to understand that technology always has values and ethics built in, and it's important to be intentional from the very beginning about what we want the effects of this technology to be.
Great. I think it's an excellent way to frame this right now. Thinking about the ethics of what's governed in and how we think of this collectively in our collective interests. So Yuta, governments have been the embodiment, for most of modern history, at least, as the model by which we govern those interests. So what is the role for government here? How does a centralized entity that has all of this bureaucracy and structure built into it work with something that sort of doesn't necessarily abide by the borders that national governments are built around, and really sort of has a very different underlying structure to it? How do we make this compatible? And what is the role for government here in terms of governing and essentially enabling the benefits of innovation, everything that's come out of these new systems?
Yeah, so in the fully decentralized world, I think it is quite difficult for government to achieve our regulatory goals, such as the consumer protection or the preventing money laundering, because there is little or no intermediaries to regulate in the system. So in short, we lose the target to regulate. So the role of the government will inevitably change in this kind of decentralized system. So of course, the government is still mandated to achieve our regulatory goals to fulfill the social benefits. So they protect the society and they protect the people's life. So it is very important role still, but it's quite challenging for us to achieve these regulatory goals in this traditional way. So for example, recently the Bitcoin adopted like new like signature technologies, Shinoa or the Lightning networks becomes bigger and bigger, so which makes it even more difficult for us to understand who does what in this decentralized system. So this means the like traditional anti-money laundering like regulation and enforcement may not gonna work in the future. So I think it's critical moment for us when it comes to balancing between innovation and regulation. So I think recognizing these difficulties, many of the government agencies are exploring ways to handle these issues, such as money laundering. For example, recently the US Department of Justice has just released their strategy to enforce regulation on crypto asset service providers. And some of the critics could heavily criticize this action because it could like destroy innovation or hinder the privacy of users. However, I think in the similar way, the FATOs, the international body working on the anti-money laundering, recently decided to start work on risks associated with peer-to-peer transactions on the blockchain. And also the G7 has just published a statement on ransomware attacks, focusing on the risks of crypto assets as a means of ransom payment. So the regulatory community is more and more pressing on this area. But at the same time, I believe it is quite important for everyone in this community, not just regulators, to discuss how we can mitigate risks for the society with minimum harm of innovation. So we need to have innovation, and I myself is the tech lover, so I don't want to destroy everything. So I think it might not necessarily the regulation is the best way to influence the actions or behaviors of the users or people in the cyberspace or even the peer-to-peer network. So like the technology can influence or the market mechanisms or social norm also can play a role. So that's why I think it is very important for the different stakeholders to get together to discuss the way we handle these new challenges. So I have joined, recently I have joined Blockchain Governance Initiative Network, BEGIN, it's kind of the multi-stakeholder place for the multi-stakeholders to discuss these kind of issues and to facilitate the discussion among different stakeholders. So at the beginning, regulator is just one of the stakeholders. So we are very open to new ideas or or even a new reality. So the things are changing. So in the past, we regulators regulate entities like banks or insurance companies and enforce the regulation. It's quite simple, but in the decentralized system, it's not that simple. So we will face difficulty to just achieve our regulatory goals. So I myself represent, no, not represent, but participate in the BEGIN as just one of the participants and one of the stakeholders to share my understanding of the how the regulators think about these new developments and ask for the different stakeholders to ideas to balance between the innovation and regulation and regulatory goals. So I think still the financial regulator is struggling to find the new ways to deal with this issue. So that's why the last year, the G20 Japan presidency pointed out these risks and the need for the cooperation among stakeholders. And fortunately, the G20 countries agreed on this concept. And also, like the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, has just published a report on the decentralized financial technologies and pointing out the importance of the cooperation. So I think the regulators is still struggling, but are heading for the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, so there was a lot there to unpack. It's one of the reasons why Yuta Takanashi is always belongs on a panel about multi-party governance and decentralization, because lots of government folks are not thinking in this broad way that he is. And so really, really useful stuff. And in fact, it's a perfect segue to Samson, because Yuta was talking there about one of the core challenge for government, Samson, is that they don't have a target to regulate. There's no entity in the way that they're typically designed to work with. And it's good to see that Yuta's team at least is thinking differently about how the government participates in these networks. But let's focus on that question, because he mentioned the Lightning Network, which of course, Blockstream has been heavily involved in sort of developing and taking advantage of, or at least that and Liquid and other systems that are designed around the principles that Yuta was talking to this separation, this right of the individual to actually sort of freely transact. How do we find compatibility between the fact that is seen as an imperative for those who build a system like Bitcoin, against the fact that governments tend to think that's the biggest challenge that they face? Is it a war between the two, or is there some way in which these systems can come together in a constructive way?
Right. So I think if a system is truly decentralized, then it's not possible to regulate it. Just because it's permissionless, anybody can participate, and there is nobody to talk to. So if you want to talk to someone at Bitcoin, there's nobody there, right? It's just miners mining and people transacting permissionlessly, and we can have different layers on top of Bitcoin, like Lightning and Liquid, and other different variations of the sidechain model. So it's actually very tricky for any government to kind of deal with this. A lot of the other cryptocurrencies out there, they're very centralized. Like they kind of partake in decentralization theater in a way where they're trying to, just one second. Okay, I think our mic was on the wrong one.
We can hear you fine, Samson.
Okay.
Carry on.
Yeah, but a lot of these systems, they're not really decentralized. So you could go to like the Ethereum Foundation or like the Ethereum developers, and you can talk to them, and they're very centralized. Like they have updates, they roll them out, and everyone must follow it. Their blockchain primarily runs on Infura, which is a centralized service. So they recently had an outage, and everything ground to a halt because nobody is actually running a node. And I think that's why for Bitcoiners, it's very important that everybody is able to run a Bitcoin core node and participate in validating and being a cyber hornet in the ecosystem, right? And it's even better if you're mining, because then you're helping to secure the network itself. So I think if it's a really decentralized system, there is no way to really regulate it. There's endpoints where you can apply compliance, like at the exchange level. And this is interesting for something like Liquid. So Liquid is not decentralized, even though there is no center. It's made up of a federation of members. But you can, the biggest members are exchanges, crypto exchanges. So they can comply with one another. So they can know if they're sending Liquid from one exchange to another exchange. They can also include some data in the transaction as well, so that they can identify, this user is sending to their own account on another exchange. But this is the kind of layer that you can apply some regulation to. But as Yuta was mentioning, Lightning Network is a different beast. It is meant to be, microtransactions at a peer-to-peer level, and there's really no way to administer that and regulate that, because the traffic is also encrypted, and you can run it over Tor as well. So I think if a governing body wants to regulate that, then they're going to have a very difficult time.
Okay, without getting into and stirring up right at this moment, maybe we can come back to it later, a big battle between Bitcoin maximalists and the Ethereum community. I do think it's interesting to sort of unpack some of what Samson was saying there, Cara, because, yes, there are, Bitcoin's certainly in a structure, to Yuta's point earlier, very difficult, in fact, impossible to find who you would, you can't pull up the CEO and so forth. But some would argue that the structure, and Yuta was talking before about how social norms and these things actually become a form of governance, that within that framework of thinking about the governance of something like Bitcoin, institutions like Blockstream itself have a a power, a kind of a centralized, some level of control as gatekeepers in the system, and that whether or not it's regulating them and how we think about that may be the solution. But the notion of what is decentralized and decentralized may not be necessarily as cut and dry, I would argue, than as the way Samson described it then. I'd like to get your thoughts, Cara, because this is, to me, a question of how systems broadly are governed, because there has to be some form of governance, whether or not there is an actual government or not that is coordinating that. And I'd like to get back to you, Samson, about how Bitcoin actually does essentially govern itself in a broad sense. Cara.
So I think that we're using governance in two constructs here. It's important to disaggregate them, right? There is the governance that is imposed on any kind of technology externally from a government, right, or other institution. And then there's, Michael, what you're talking about in terms of how you design a system. There's some kind of self-governance in that, right? So when we have these decentralized systems, you're designing them at the beginning and you're designing the rules into them. So that's kind of the governance inside the actual system itself, right? And there are the communities that participate in these blockchain communities, right? Whether you're talking about when you're initially setting up the rules for a system and understanding what's going to be validated on a system and what's not going to be validated on a system, or whether you're talking about these continuing communities of stakeholders, right? And I think that for decentralized systems, as you said, Michael, these communities of stakeholders are really, really important. And I think, one of the things we need to be careful about is who are these communities of stakeholders that have an effect, right? Is it a very narrow segment of population? I know we talked before in terms of, who gets a say in terms of how these systems are governed is really important. So do we have really narrow slices of society that are basically effectively determining the entire governance of these decentralized systems? I think that's a really important issue when it comes to the effect that this technology is going to have on different people in society. And I do think that, we've talked a lot in the cryptocurrency example, but we also use decentralized systems for a lot of other things. And I think when you're talking about digitally native assets, it's maybe much simpler to understand kind of the internal governance regimes and how that affects everything that happens on the chain. But the fact is that one of the layers you always have to have around a decentralized system, if you're trying to equate it to physical objects in the real world, is what is the governance of how you equate those digital assets with the physical real world. So I think that, to Samson's point, there's kind of the chain itself, right, the decentralized systems themselves, but then there's these layers around. So what are you really talking about? Are you talking about the layers outside and how you're governing those? And maybe there's more direct ways to govern those? Or are you talking about the actual decentralized systems themselves?
Great. Again, more excellent framing here. I do want to get to Yuta to talk a little bit about the multi-party governance systems that his team is working on. But before, Samson, can we just go back to you? Because, when you think back to things like the block size debate, right? What seemed really interesting to me in the way that emerged was the fact that people assumed that miners were the ones who had complete control over the system. And it turns out that users and all sorts of other entities and parties, developers, also had power in that. And so what you kind of saw in live real time was how Bitcoin as a kind of an amorphous, collected entity governed itself. Can you describe that dynamic in some way, just so people get an understanding of the way that people like you think about Bitcoin governance as a global concept, really?
Right. So I'll just jump back really quick to the point you mentioned before. Like you said, you could regulate Blockstream and therefore regulate Bitcoin. But Blockstream is just one group that does contribute to Bitcoin development, but we are not the only one. There are several other groups and a lot of developers, and some of the developers are pseudonymous or unknown. You don't know who they are. So that's why I think Bitcoin is a really decentralized system, because you have all these people, all these companies contributing, and anybody can participate. There's no leader in the group. But there is like a common narrative that Blockstream is like controlling Bitcoin development, but that's just entertaining, I think. But back to the other point, like Cara, you're mentioning if the blockchain is like the registry and you have physical assets. But in my view, I think if you are doing some kind of attested asset, then it is not decentralized. So if you're trying to put gold bars on a blockchain, I don't think that system would be decentralized in any way, because you have to rely on some physical custodian in the real world. And it's much like a security or a security token at that point, because there's a company, and that's not a decentralized system either, because there's a company issuing the shares or tokens in this thing. Or if any attested asset would not be decentralized, at least not in my book. So I think the only asset that is decentralized is Bitcoin, and it's a digital asset that has no bearing on anything in the physical world.
Okay, so Yuta, why don't you give us a little bit of a description, perhaps, of how you would foresee a multi-party system? Maybe elaborate a little bit on the points you're making at the end of that comments that you made at the beginning there. And I'd like to think perhaps about what lessons can be learned from internet governance, because this isn't the first time we've had to grapple with a decentralized architecture. The internet itself posed these challenges to governments and to companies, and there's a model there that perhaps gives us at least some lessons to think about.
Yeah, I think the Cara pointed out a very important aspect, because it around the layering issues, like the bottom layer of the blockchain itself could be a completely decentralized one, but still there could be a layer that impose like some controls the activity within the blockchain. Like the Samson mentioned that the Liquid is still somehow decentralized, but still they have some control, the governance body and control, and to know who does what in the system. So not necessarily the regulator should focus on the bottom layer of the system. So like the internet, there could be a layering of the system in the future. Like right now, the Bitcoin or Ethereum is seemingly it's very vertically integrated, but in the future maybe there could be different layers, and in some layers we can control the impose KYC or ML kind of obligation. So how we compose the system is very important question. And also when it comes to think about technology development, probably the regulators should also participate in the technology development process, like not regulating technology itself, because we want to take the technology neutral approach to harness innovation, but still we need to provide our views to the development process. Like when this technology is deployed, probably the regulators need to do some actions, like the imposing enforcement action or such kind of thing. Then encourage developers to think about the slightly different way or slightly different direction, or if they go their own way, probably we should think about how we can talk with a business person to think about market mechanisms or broader society for the social norms. So there's lots of different ways, not just regulating technology, but to influence the people behavior within this community. So the JFSA try to reach out to the developer community or business community to understand what they're thinking and what they're doing, and also encourage them to somehow look around the different stakeholders, like ask the developers to release the report from the regulatory community, and then there may be the way to have some common ground and have some common goals to pass it together. I believe that no Bitcoin engineers want the Bitcoin to be used by the criminal actors, or create weapons, or do the terror attacks. So I think we can agree on very fundamental ideas on what is a social good, or how should this technology could be used. So I don't think the technology itself can be evil, but the way people use could be evil. So how we can prevent people using new technology or promising technology in the bad way. So we can I hope we can find a way to like cooperate together to find the new solution, not just regulation, but also technology or social norm or market mechanisms. So I think this is a way the Lawrence Lessig framed in the issues around like governance of the behavior of the cyberspace. So he said not just regulation, but also the different factors should be used to like somehow like control the behavior within the cyberspace to like somehow achieve the social benefits. So I think it's very important concept, and also we need to learn what the internet community do in this space. So I think the most important concept within the internet community is multi-stakeholder governance. So we are still learning, but I think we can apply the learning in some way to the decentralized financial system as well.
Great, Yuta. There's a lot of questions coming in, which is great to see, and a number of them are focusing on the concept of the DAO. That's a decentralized autonomous organization, and this is a critical concept of governance that has emerged out of the blockchain space. Essentially that no single entity or individual is in charge, but there is built into the mechanism a means by which the common interest is pursued. Some could even argue that Bitcoin itself is a DAO, that is how it functions. You can take this concept broader. So I'd just like to open it up. Maybe, Cara, you could weigh in there. People are asking sort of questions about what role for government, and essentially maybe you could answer this other one as well, is like why aren't governments paying attention to this? But maybe, Cara, if you could just start off, is a DAO a reasonable way to think about how we can govern these systems?
I do think it is a reasonable way to think about it. I think it's important to recognize, you talked about it, you're building into the mechanisms what is in the common interest, right? I think one of the places the multi-stakeholder comes in is figuring out, for what stakeholders are we talking about the common interest, right? So as you build up these systems, how do you decide what is in the common interest? How should these systems be established? Because what you're doing is you're codifying in terms of the effects that you want to come out of a system, right? So I think that's really important. And I think that, once again, it goes to the question of, you talk about how do you govern these systems, externally, right? How do governments potentially govern these systems? I think it's important to think about the tools that governments and institutions have of governance are, one, you can govern the actual technology, right? Or you can govern the outcomes of the technology, right? So I think you have to have a multimodal approach there. One, in terms of looking at, who are the stakeholders who are involved and how the systems are set up for, quote, the common interest. But then two, what are the impacts? For instance, we mentioned before kind of the right to be forgotten. Well, that's a way of governing impact. It doesn't say anything about a technology, but it has huge implications for how technologies are established if you're going to put information somewhere that then there's a right to be forgotten.
I want to pick up on the right to be forgotten because there's some of the broad principles, at least of a blockchain like Bitcoin, is that it is immutable and nothing is forgotten. But Samson, maybe you can touch on that. But I'd also like to get your thoughts on DAOs. How viable are they? Do existing public blockchains such as Bitcoin provide the right framework for a DAO in the future?
Well, in the past, a lot of the DAOs, they're almost like an investment vehicle. You put some money in and then everyone votes on something to invest in. And you could look at it as, some kind of futuristic technology or application of Bitcoin technology. But you can also look at it as, some people are just trying to circumvent securities laws, right? Because if you are doing that, then it's a joint effort to invest in something for financial gain, which passes the Howey test. So, there's that aspect. And a lot of these projects also are trying to sell a governance token for a DAO too. But, if someone is selling you a governance token, is that really a DAO? Because I'm printing some money and giving you a ticket, but you need to pay for that ticket. And I might hold a lot of those governance tokens. So does your vote really matter? So the challenge is the idea of a DAO is interesting, but in real world application, it's really just, they can be quite scammy. And in execution, they're done very poorly with, typically they're hacked and everyone loses money, which was the case for Ethereum. But like touching back on one of the earlier points about decentralized governance, I think the Bitcoin model where you can opt out if you don't like it is probably the only way to govern a decentralized system. And we kind of saw this with the Bitcoin scaling war when a lot of companies and miners said they wanted to increase the block size. And in the end, the governance is determined by the end users, the economic powerhouse, right? So basically the Bitcoin users, people buying Bitcoin, are paying the miners. So if the miners decided to impose a change on the network, the users would just say, okay, well, we're not going to pay you anymore. We're not following your fork. And I think that is the only way to really govern. It's really just users being able to determine what they opt into. And if they don't like some change, they can opt out. That's why I think backwards compatibility is very important. And that's kind of a driving element of Bitcoin development, which is, every Bitcoin update is not going to fork you off or create a hard fork. You can still run your old version and the rule set is compatible.
Okay, before we go to the next question, this is just an audience, there is a poll that we'll be putting up now. We've got about 10 minutes till we close this session, so feel free to answer that question. You'll see it up in the top right-hand corner of your panel. We'll see if we can sort of look at the results of those just before we close up. So I want to shift to this right to be forgotten, because it is, certainly in Europe, such an integral part of the way GDPR was designed. And it speaks actually to different ways of thinking about privacy, and privacy being, a hot button issue for the world generally, in an environment where we are just capturing so much data about people's behavior, and how much of that data is now being controlled by centralized entities. So, Cara, maybe, you could just sort of frame that discussion, because it seems to me that sometimes that it's focusing on all the wrong things. It's about the very problem of a centralized entity controlling that data and how that is manipulated, as opposed to sort of like my rights as an individual and how I control that. I mean, maybe just where do you see somehow this integration of a decentralized, immutable record-keeping system with this demand for privacy and the right to be forgotten?
I think it's a challenging, this is, when we talk about kind of technology and humanity crashing together, I think this is one of the examples, right? And it's also an example, GDPR is in the European Union, right? It's a law from the European Union. But at the same time, it has rippling effects around the world. So one of the things that we think about when we think about decentralized systems is that they transcend governance, they transcend nations, they transcend governance regimes, right? So that they exist in a separate space. But yet I think GDPR is the perfect example of a law that was passed by the European Union that ripples all over the world and does affect in terms of what technologies can be accessed and can be used in different places. So I don't know that I have a clean answer for you about how these two things are compatible, because I think sometimes they're potentially incompatible, right? To have a truly decentralized system and you have information in there and it's immutable. You can't take that information out. So how, beyond kind of the cryptocurrency examples, how can you start to have these systems existing in a place which now is kind of globally where GDPR is going to affect you?
Actually, maybe Samson, you could just pick up on this a bit, because I often feel like there is sometimes confusion around what exactly does exist on the blockchain and what's readable, if you like, and what's off-chain. And that maybe therein lies the way in which we resolve some of these privacy concerns.
Well, there are some projects out there that want to put data on a blockchain, but that's not really a scalable model, because every blockchain is a broadcast mechanism. So when someone is making a Bitcoin transaction, you have to receive that transaction, and it's stored on the blockchain on your computer for all eternity. So I don't think it's a good idea to be putting lots of stuff into a blockchain. And I think Bitcoin's financial use case is the best case. It's just financial transactions. And yeah, so I don't really know how the two things tie together. I don't think it really relates directly.
Okay. Yuta, maybe just this, and then we could frame this a little bit around that question, but also the one that came up about DAOs as well in the chat. Our governments, how are governments grappling with something like a DAO? And what is the current thinking on whether it's a right to be forgotten or just generally privacy as something government should be protecting, and GDPR being a model for that, and blockchain systems?
Yeah, I think in general, the fully decentralized system or the fully autonomous system, and I'm not sure if they got the scale or they're accepted by huge number of people, because usually the centralized controllers or centralized intermediaries support the users to use these new technologies. So the usability or the flexibility is not at this moment, at least, it's very difficult for people to use this completely decentralized, completely autonomous system. So that's why I think the government usually thinks the DAO or fully decentralized system, like Samson mentioned, it's kind of the consumer protection issues. So I think if there is completely decentralized autonomous system is widely accepted, then the world will change dramatically, and the government, as Samson mentioned in the area, there is nothing government can do to enforce regulation or impose regulation. But at least at this moment, usually there is some people or some physical person get involved in some providing services or developing technologies. So still we can have some access to these people or these companies or entities. So I'm not sure what will happen in the future, in 10 years or 20 years, but at least at this moment, we are focusing on talking with those who develop technology or those who use technologies. So, but of course, in 10 years or 20 years, I'm not sure. So, and also the privacy, I think, not just in the big blockchain or decentralized system, the privacy and the enforceability is always the difficult question. Enforcement, regulation, or the catch criminals is one of the justice. On the other hand, protecting privacy is the another justice. This kind of the conflicting two right things. So there, as Cara mentioned, even when we think about incorporating rules into code or technology, still we need to resolve this kind of difficult politics. So there is no right or wrong things. Both of them is right thing. So we need to judge value. But the question is whether the blockchain developers or community or blockchain community is well represented. So sometimes the underrepresented people have very strong influence from these technologies. Then so when we think about incorporating the rules into the code, it's kind of the rule making or legislation. It's very similar. So all the different perspectives should be provided when the engineers decide what value is incorporated in the code. So that's why I think it is very important for us to have different stakeholders and different angles or stakes into the code development or the rule making. It's at least regulation is subject to the huge debate among different stakeholders at the Congress or at least within the regulatory community. But the code development is still under the surface for me. It seems so. I'm not sure the developers fully understand the very different stakes or very different viewpoints to decide which is coded.
Okay, so let's jump on that because we just ran really tight on time. I want to mention the results of our poll, which of course is the question whether public permission blockchains are compatible with existing government corporate and legal structures, a fairly strong no, 73.3% saying no, and only 26.7% saying yes. Samson, I think you're eager to have the last word here. I'm not sure how you managed to negotiate that, but you're getting it for some reason. Very, very quickly, thoughts on that, or you wanted to make some final comments, and then we have to close up.
So I think the DAOs in the current form that we know of them, largely based on Ethereum, are very easy for a government to regulate. They rely heavily on marketing. So they need frontmen to go and put on their website. So you know it's Vitalik, this guy, this guy, this guy. So if you want to regulate it, you can go and find those people. Ethereum has no privacy, and they like to use the .eth name. So it's like Vitalik.eth. And that allows any blockchain analytics company to trace funds that are going into the DAO. They can associate back to a username because blockchains are public and anybody can read the data. So at the worst stage, you just go to Infera and you issue a cease and desist and shut them down, and then the DAO is gone.
So we're closing out on an Ethereum attack, which is it's certainly some very, very rich debate. We could go on a long time with this discussion between what exactly is a purely permissionless system and what's not. But I think at this stage, guys, we're going to just have to wrap it up. We're running tight on time. Thank you very much, Cara LaPointe, Yuta Takanashi, Samson Mow. A rich discussion. You can just tell by the fact that I had to cut Samson off there that we could have been going on for a lot longer. But anyway, there's much more to come, and I think we're going to be joined by some folks from the OECD. Caroline's coming back to let you know what's happening up next. But from my point of view, thank you for having me, and thanks very much for this great session.
Thank you very much, Michael, and to all of our panelists. That was a fantastic discussion and also very interesting for our audience. We could tell because there was a lot of engagement and a lot of questions for you. Hopefully you'll all have a chance to jump into the platform. I know we didn't get to answer all of the audience questions, but hopefully you'll be able to jump in and give some answers to those there. Thank you very much for all of you who were able to join us. I'm very excited about the program we have coming up for the rest of this afternoon, or perhaps this morning, depending on where you are. I will just mention a couple of the sessions. We will first be starting with a workshop, and these will all begin in about 15 minutes time. We'll start with a workshop looking at the application of DOT in the US Treasury for federal grants disbursement. We'll also be having a session on tax, the new report that was launched to the G20 finance ministers in October on the taxation of virtual currencies, and also a deep dive into asset tokenization. We covered it a little bit this morning, but there's still a lot more to say, and we look forward to welcoming you back for that at 3:35 CET, that's Paris time. And then later in the afternoon, you come back for more discussions on public sector innovation, so government uses of DOT, so talk about how governments can support SMEs and entrepreneurs in adoption of the technology, and finally DeFi. We don't want to miss out on that. There will be a discussion there led by Lawrence Wintermeyer from Global Digital Finance. Thank you very much for everyone for being such active participants in the discussion. It's great to have you here at the 2020 Global Blockchain Policy Forum. We'll be back in about 13 minutes. Thanks a lot.